Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Stephen Kelts, who's a lecturer at SPIA, but he's also with us this year. He's a professional specialist here in responsible computing curricula. Here at CITP, he works along with computer science faculty to integrate a responsible ethics into their curricula. He also leads a program on agile ethics. I think some of the work that he's presenting today is some preliminary study from that area. Apart from working with us, he also works in the nonprofit sector. He's an ethics advisor for Responsible AI Institute, and he's the director of Responsible Tech University Network for All Tech is Human. So with that, we're excited to hear about your new project and the preliminary work that you have.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for being here, and also thank you to CITP for being so welcoming this year. As a longtime ethics professor, it's at least possible that entering a world of technology policy people, I would have felt like the odd man out, but I have not this year. It's been very welcoming. And so like to tell you now a little bit about what I do in a study that we did on it. So the talk is called Agile Ethics, and you'll see that that name comes from a role play system that I actually use in the classroom, which is part of the intervention that I'm going to present to you. And so I'm going to present basically a justification for the pedagogy that I've been using in a big SPIA class called Tech Ethics. A justification for that pedagogy, then a psychological theory that we measured then to see if the pedagogy was actually having the hypothesized effects, and then some preliminary data showing that it is having some of these effects. We'll have to get into the specifics of that later. Actually, I should take the word effects out of my talk now. You'll see why in a second. The type of study we did, some things I can't infer from the study. I don't know if the pedagogy had these effects, but we'll see the data in a second. Okay. So yeah, I don't think with this crowd, I need to actually point out some of the problems caused by socio-technical systems in the past number of years, right? We have problems of bias, which our own Ruha Benjamin has spoken so eloquently about, and which our own Surya Matthew has written about in that article you see there, machine bias. We have problems of trust or over-trust in systems. There's a Brookings article indicated here about an enrollment algorithm. I don't know if you've ever heard about this one, but an enrollment algorithm that some schools were using to distribute financial aid to maximize enrollment. And what it did was just distribute all financial aid away from juniors and seniors. It figured out they had sunk costs and they'd stick around anyway, right? So it was giving all the money to freshmen. There's problems of privacy and de-anonymization of data sets, which our own Arvind Narayan has worked on. There's problems of security, like the Microsoft Azure breach last summer. Problems of safety online. That's Zuck testifying about children's safety on his platforms, and problems of autonomy, which I take the social dilemma to be about. Okay, these are the problems that we're trying to address. And so you might think to yourself, with all of this going on in the tech industry, man, we need an ethics professor, right? And as Titi said, I'm working with the computer science department. I don't want to talk myself out of a job, but let me tell you the truth. Or at least they don't work in the way that people would think that they work. Okay. So what we find when we actually study the effects of ethics classes is that there's very little evidence that they substantively change people's views. If they previously thought that a particular action was right, or at least okay, the classes don't convince them that that action is wrong in some sense, with a couple of exceptions that I'll get into in a second, because they're important for developing the theory here. But there are a lot of main approaches that occur in ethics classes, right, which may account for some of these weaknesses. For one thing, oftentimes ethics classes are presenting labeled cases, or what we call explicit cases, where the ethical problem caused by a particular technology or a particular set of actions is directly labeled, and the students are told, these people did this, it resulted in X bad outcome, and etc. There may be a problem there. Students don't learn how technology A led to bad outcome B. They're only made afraid of bad outcome B. So these are horror stories, and they may have some effect. We'll talk about that later, what you do need from them. Case studies are a little bit better. A common one in engineering classroom is the Challenger disaster, where there were two engineers who knew that of a certain age, So I was watching in middle school when, they said Challenger, go at throttle up, right? So the problem there, the Challenger exploded because of these frozen O-rings. There were two engineers who knew it was going to happen. And they were like in their car, I think driving from Florida to Houston, trying to like get there in time to tell Mission Command, please don't do this. So that actually good case studies can get a little bit further into both the technical processes that led to these mistakes and also the organizational and decisional processes that led people to be unaware of these mistakes a little better. They use philosophy lectures, and that's great if you want to teach reading and writing in depth. I came over the course of time to think that that was really what I was doing at universities, was teaching reading and writing and not affecting ethics in some way. But it's not clear to a student when to use this reasoning, except when they're being examined on it or asked to write a paper. A lot of people also use science fiction, right? But the problem is scholars of science fiction will even say what science fiction tends to do is to reinscribe the horrors of now into a future story, right? And so in reality, it doesn't let us see a new thing coming when you implement infinite scroll behind the back of Instagram or something like that. It doesn't allow us to see the addiction or whatever, unless we have an example of that in the past, right? So these main approaches, I think, are subject to something I'm calling the affirmation illusion. Ethics professors thought that they were teaching ethics and ethical behavior, ethical decision-making, and so on and so forth. But students' substantive views weren't changing unless they were around the table with you or writing in a paper or et cetera, et cetera. Now, there are some important exceptions to this idea that classes don't change students' substantive views. Schwitzgable, Copeland, and Singer in 2020, that's our own Peter Singer, Professor Emeritus here, published a paper where they studied 1,300 undergrads. That number is going to become important later. 1,300 undergrads who were going through a required ethics class at a very large school. And they were able to do basically, an intervention where they gave some of these students a precept, a section about the ethics of eating meat, i.e. the ethics of not eating meat. If you've ever met Peter, you know that's his take. And they walked the others through the ethics of effective altruism, because it had to be Peter on both sides of the equation, right? And then they studied the students, and the students who had gone through the not eating meat precept, their receipts from campus dining halls for the next number of weeks showed a 4% reduction in meat consumption. Okay? And 4 weeks out, they were saying some slightly substantively small change, but significant change, that they thought it was wrong to eat meat. Some percentage of them, again, some small percentage of them were saying that. Right. There's also a series of studies out of a lab that I think is in Oklahoma. This paper reference here is from, I think Mumford is the head of this lab, but the paper is Watts et al. Right. But here, the effects that actually are shown tend to be, from that lab, tend to be in these very domain-specific courses. So here's an engineering course, and we're actually going to teach you an engineering code of ethics, right? It might be the ACM code of ethics. It might be whatever. Here's a medical course. We're going to teach you the Hippocratic Oath and et cetera, et cetera. So these results tend to say that when you're teaching these distinct codes, evidence is suggesting that students are becoming more aware of ethical issues. That's one thing, right? Hey, I spot an ethical issue there. They're becoming more reflective in their responses, so they're using judgment, that philosophical reasoning better, and they're likely to endorse more appropriate judgments there. So one thing to think about, that's not the study on the table here, but one thing to think about would be, is that a good route for the computer science department here also to begin to teach the ACM code of ethics or whatever it might be, because that anchor in codes seems to have some effect. Okay, but otherwise, outside of usually grim results on in the studies that I've mentioned so far, there's a sort of glimmer of hope. Karem Akhtar and Tanya Lombroso, along with a couple of other co-authors, in 2023 published a paper where they looked at a Princeton class, actually. Ethics Introduction to Moral Philosophy here had grown to about 350 students, and that seems like a good number to start trying to get a study going. And what they found was that there was substantial change in views, so statistically significant and substantially large change in views. But they also studied the cognitive mechanisms that might have account for this, right? And what they found was that among all of the students, if you took all the students, the class had had the effect of decreasing their reliance on intuition in making moral decisions, as they were tested later, increasing their reliance on deliberation. There are a bunch of moral psychologists out there who think that all moral judgments end up coming from intuition, but the course decreased their reliance on intuition, increased their reliance on deliberation. Could be thought of as good, might be thought of as unexpected, might be thought of as bad, right? But it seemed to happen. But the thing was, the substantive and statistically significant change in views actually came more from the students who had decreased, because students had decreased their reliance on intuition. That was what actually predicted change in the students, not increased deliberation. And here's the funky part, is this last result listed up here, we might and probably should think of as bad. The increased deliberation predicted more confidence in the same view they had had before, right? So the arrogant philosophy student problem. Oh, shit, I'm being recorded. Shouldn't have said that. Right. So they're now just more certain that they can give you reasons why they've always been right. Okay. So that could be a problem. What if we started over, right? And thought to ourselves, hey, let's not look at, my first slide was about the substantive things that had happened. It was all about horror stories and people who've done good work studying those horror stories. But what if we started over and thought, what's really going wrong in the tech development process that's leading to some of those horror stories? And given what we know about the psychology of belief and behavior change, what could we hypothesize about an intervention that might address some of these things, right? So one thing could be, what if tech developers just don't know what's right? Okay, Quantan Tat is still the CEO of Clearview AI, and he's out on podcasts all the time saying, yeah, it's totally okay. We scraped billions of images off of the public internet, Instagram, and so on and so forth, because they had been labeled public. They weren't private, so they were there for us to take, use, train, great, to take, use, train, and so on and so forth, right? So it could be that he just doesn't know that that was wrong. That could also be a case of maladaptive values, that use of, if my dad had used that understanding of privacy when he was doing things in the 70s or 80s, something that would have been an appropriate use of the concept of private and public and et cetera, but it's maladapted to our technological environment today. But this is probably not the correct assumption about what's going wrong in the dev process, and it's condescending as well. So I worked with a lot of people who've taught this in a lot of different places, and you walk into a classroom of engineering students and they're going to sniff if you're operating on this assumption. I'm here to tell you what's right, right? Ain't nobody got time for that. Okay, what if something that could also be possibly true, people who are developing this technology know what's wrong, but they're doing the wrong thing anyway, right? If you know Zuck's famous apology letter from 2004-ish, when he first created Face Mash on the Harvard campus, he said, I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway, right? Face Mash, you may remember, was the first product he released in which the photographs of undergraduate women were compared with barn animals and people were voted. Right? He said, I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway. Later in Facebook's troubled history, there's this memo from Andrew Bosworth called The Ugly, in which he says, the ugly truth is that Facebook connects people. We know that this could spark a terrorist attack. We know that bullying is occurring because of it. We know it's the middle of the year 2016, and they may well have been aware of organization that was going on among Sri Lankans to target Muslims. Came out in the news a few weeks later. The same thing, as you know, then later happened in Myanmar. Okay, maybe that they knew all these things, but we still connect people. That's what he said. That's our goal, right? Well, in situations like this, it may be that they know what's wrong, but there's a failure of intent or will or something like that. And people will explain it that way, faced with the pressure of capitalism, an overly large explanation, or the next cycle's profits, or a boss who's telling you to get the product out anyway, or whatever it is. Faced with organizational structures, they know what's right, but they fail at the moment of intent or will to carry out what's right because of these other pressures, right? That could be what's going on. And then Another hypothesis could be failures of anticipation, right? So that people literally are not seeing that if they develop the product in this way, the technology in this way, right, it may have these problems down the line. And the thing about this assumption is that it assumes good people that are placed in work situations and also knowledge environments that don't support these good decisions, that don't support anticipation, reflection, the formation of intent, and so on and so forth, right? And when you actually look at the developers themselves who've been initiated some of these scandals, right? What they say is that problem was unforeseen. There's actually a bunch of ethical problems that need to be worked on here. You'll see later, I'm going to narrow it down to just one, but that problem was unforeseen. Okay, well, then you need foresight of a certain sort. And we've got people working on that, the ability to envision results before they happen. That problem, to skip over one, was unintended, right? Okay, well, intention requires the ability to intervene in causes that might bring about a result, bringing about the intended result. So I intended to move my right arm and my left moved instead is a problem in electrical signaling somewhere in the body, right? So that could be a problem as well. There was an intent to do X, what happened instead was Y. That's a problem that you could work on. So I've already noted three things that are possible to study and work on, but that this study is not about. This is not about ACM codes. That might be important. This is not a study about foresight analysis, although that could be important. This is not a study about intention, although that could be important. Instead, we looked at and are thinking about anticipation. Now, to sort of train ethical anticipation requires a person to be able to make a judgment of cause effect in the social world and to see that action A may end up resulting in results X, Y, Z, and so on, right? And all of those words, and frequently unanticipated, that was an unanticipated consequence of my actions, are used by developers themselves. All right, people are working on this, right? Here's a proposed solution to it, a framework. Right? A dev framework, that is. And Stilgo, Owen, and McNaughton say in this paper about this development framework, they say, well, you're going to have to set up work processes in such a way that they foster anticipation, reflexivity or reflection, thinking about one's own action, inclusion for lots of different reasons, but in part to address the problem of bias, right? And responsiveness, which you could think of as intent and willing, right? So that once I see there is a problem, once I see that stakeholder groups are affected by it, that I actually then respond in kind to that in the midst of the development process. But here's a problem with that. A framework without a skill set or a behavioral change or a thought change of some sort is going to be DOA. It's not going to be implemented properly. There's also team dynamics that surround this, what's called team ethical culture. And so frameworks, even with good intent and good thinking, can also be DOA if there's a bad ethical culture, et cetera. But important to it is that there be a skill set or a mental picture. For the people in the back of the room, or perhaps for people everywhere, I apologize for how busy all these slides are, but I'll talk you through this one. So we started thinking about this. I started thinking about this many years ago in some work that I did with Google on their workshops called Moral Imagination workshops. Ben Zevenbergen and Amanda McCroskey presented on those last year. So we started thinking theoretically in terms of psychology literature, what would we be thinking about here if we wanted to work on these elements of the dev process, right? The ability to anticipate, the ability to morally reason, the ability to form intent in complex environments, et cetera. And this sounded a lot like the theory laid out by James Rest in 1986. He was a student of Lawrence Kohlberg, and I could get into that story if you want, but this is Rest's theory in 86, and they have a test for this that they call the defining issues test and defining issues test 2. And they actually find that as people develop as maturing human beings, they reach higher levels on this defining issues test, defined by these categories. And they also find that people who take in courses in philosophy and political science and policy, et cetera, also tend to score better on these. So there's some validation and confirmation here that the test is actually picking up a real element of ethical decision-making. But the process that they're testing for is moral awareness, one, right? It's defined on the side here. For a person to be morally aware, the skill set that they would need to have is that they would need to be information seeking, and they would need lenses through which they could interpret that information. So what information should I be gathering, right? Am I measuring what matters? To use the words of John Doerr. Am I measuring what matters, right? OKRs and so forth. Whose perspectives should I be listening to? Who are the stakeholders in this group? They need to be looking outside of themselves to be morally aware at what acts are available to them, and Rest calls that imagination or projection. He calls that, hence moral imagination at Google. What consequences would there be of my actions? To whom do those consequences matter, and et cetera? You need to look inside of yourself. It's also an aspect of social cognition. It's not self-analysis of a certain sort, but what emotions do I have and how are those going to change my actions? What are my own interests and are those going to matter for conditioning my actions? Do I have biases and are those going to matter, and so forth? And you need epistemic humility of a certain sort. Do I trust my own judgment on this, or might I actually need help understanding what even would be a good solution to this problem? Turning to experts, diverse stakeholder groups, and lots of things that people talk about in tech development. And all of that is going on even before anybody forms a judgment. What could be the problem with philosophy classes? Well, most ethics classes only cover the moral reasoning, and they're not telling students how to scan their environment in any of these 4 ways indicated on the slide here, let alone telling their students how to formulate moral intent when they then do have a judgment, right? And then again, of course, let alone behaving in an environment. You could have an intent, but your environment thwarts you, right? And so if we really wanted ethical change of a certain sort, we'd need to be working on all parts of this process, but in particular, moral awareness, right? If the problem in tech is that these difficulties are in fact unanticipated, right? Then we need people better scanning their technological environment, better scanning what's going on their dev team, better scanning the technology and its intended use cases and so on and so forth, so that they can do all of the things to become aware that I've indicated here. Okay, so if you thought of this as a student journey through their education, resulting in somebody who was morally aware, capable of judgment, forming intents, and so on and so forth, you might think, all right, start with cases, right? Horror stories, label cases. Is the student aware of past cases in which tech has failed? That could be important for helping them start to think about history can repeat itself, right? So get them ready for that. But then you also want to work on issue spotting as well. In the sort of uncertain environment of development, can the student spot potential failures and potential new failures, not just from the horror stories, but potential new failures coming down the line. So you'd have to have them working on unlabeled cases as well. Then, can they reason in the face of disagreement? Right? And in the work with Google, I can get into that later, but that's one of their most important findings with their engineers, which is a development team can actually just be stymied if they have a set of disagreements about, say, the rollout of, this is a good example from just this past summer, the rollout of Gemini image production, which was producing Black and Asian American Vikings and et cetera. And there is a story there behind the team that actually developed that set of system prompts that was developing those outputs, and just a set of disagreements and miscommunications about what ethics of representation or structural justice things would have even meant. And when these teams come to loggerheads and don't have a way to reason through it, right, there's a real problem. The tech is still going to move forward, but it's going to move forward built perhaps awkwardly and clunkily because people aren't in disagreement about where it's headed. And the Google folks have found that it's not like they're getting a team, they're not growing sunflowers in the field with these teams. It's not all rainbows and puppy dogs. But if they have a little bit of ethical language from theories to be able to discuss their disagreements with each other, they at least understand that you've got people of goodwill on each side of this, and we're trying to move forward with doing the right thing. Okay. But then when we think about sort of forming an intent, we might think about a student needing to be able to discern how to use technical solutions that they're learning in their classrooms to actually address the issues that they've spotted and that they've reasoned about, and so on and so forth, right? But then also, when we think about translating that intent into behavior, they need to know something about the complex workflows that they're about to step into, right? The best of intentions might be thwarted by a manager, a boss, a poor information environment, and all the things I mentioned earlier. So they should be alerted to the fact that those things may end up causing problems for them. Okay, so, wow. We developed basically a theory of what these cognitive changes would look like were you able to teach a student to sort of transform their ethical decision-making in this way. And the theory was developed by the 4 people listed there: Emily Foster Hansen, who was previously a postdoc at CHV, me, Tanya Lombroso, I believe it's the Concepts and Cognition Lab at Neuroscience, and Karim Akhtar in the neuroscience building, that is, in the psychology department, and Karim Akhtar, who's I believe, a grad student there now. And I do want to point out here 2 things. I am not aware of the naming conventions in the field of psychology, and so I listed alphabetically here. Nothing is meant to be implied by this list. 2, also, since I don't do a lot of this work, I forgot an acknowledgement slide here. Google funded this study by funding Emily Foster Hansen, and I don't have the name of that grant, the number of that grant for you. I have it, but not in these slides. I should have. I apologize. Okay, but here was the idea, right? A well-designed ethics class would or should, we think, to have all the effects that I've talked about earlier on making the development process go better, and making the implementation of these frameworks, like I talked about earlier, making that stick with the developers. It should do what Karim and Tanya and 2 other co-authors found before in their 2023 paper. Is it should increase the propensity of the student to reason. It should decrease their reliance on intuition. It should increase their moral awareness. The REST study, but also there's a specific test for that. I'm not in this talk going to actually get into the instrument that we use, although I have it in an appendix, and I could talk about it if you want. But there's an instrument for measuring moral awareness that was developed by and published by Reynolds in 2006. Right. But specifically for our study, right, we would want to look for an increase in the recognition that unlabeled cases are morally fraught. Right. Presented with a tech development story, right, with no hint of a potential ethical problem in it, are students who went through a well-designed ethics class able to say, I think I see a problem coming. Right? And in fact, that's part of how we tested them. Was we gave them the same exact story about the same exact technology and the same exact company, and we just added a sentence saying, engineers are concerned that this ethical problem would emerge, and we tested labeled versus unlabeled. What differences did we get? A well-designed course should see an increase in information seeking. It should see an increase in the desire for expert opinions, right? Again, that was part of the theory of moral awareness, right? Looking outside the self to what sort of information I need. Should see an increase in the propensity to seek diverse perspectives before making a decision, right? And then thinking about the last part, the way that the dev cycle is positioned within corporate structures that might thwart ethical decision making. It should also affect the student's ability to handle, it should increase their ability to handle system complexity, the social environment of development, a theory that's further developed in Foster Hansen and Vikentagiri, 2024. And so the hypothesis there, the hope was that a well-designed class should decrease students' confidence in their ability to make a judgment, right? It's going to get more complex than this. There are things you still have not seen. It should increase their perceived difficulty of forming a judgment about a particular technology in a particular company. It should decrease their sense that the outcomes are predictable. It should lead them to prioritize ethical values. So, for instance, increase their propensity to look at the users and at society's goals as they're developing the technology, and decrease their emphasis on the company's profits, or we actually just called it the organization's goals, but this is the thing we were thinking. Decrease their propensity to think about the company's profits and their personal advancement in the company as compared to ethical values. And in terms of those very same things measured about the social norms that prevail within the technology industry, it should decrease their sense that tech developers prioritize social values. All right, we're not trying to say here that we want them to go out having a horror of the people in tech. That's not it. But if they get a decreased sense of the priorities that are around them, then that becomes a problem that they can work on, right? Okay, so what would a well-designed ethics class look like? I don't know. I'm 23 years into it. Damned if I know, but I tried. And really, part of the personal story here is I tried to entirely remake everything I had been doing up to 2018, right? Which was my 21st year in academia, if you count grad school, right? So, old dog, new tricks. Did they work? That's basically the question of the next few minutes, right? Okay, so given the theory, it would seem like there still need to be some traditional ethics lectures in there to work on reasoning versus intuition. Increase one, decrease the other, and etc. So cases, horror stories should still be there. It would seem like, and this is the thing we invented from scratch, right? In the way that we are doing it. I want to say also there's really good work at Georgia Tech, Purdue, and George Mason, big engineering schools, on the use of different forms of role plays and etc. But we are doing them a different way here. There should be role plays and simulations to work on issue spotting in the unlabeled cases, because that's a huge problem, the problem of anticipation, that a seemingly non-moral situation could lead to an ethical problem down the line. So identify those information gaps and find when you need those new perspectives. And then there should also be lectures and writing assignments to understand the complexity of the social environment, the social system of development, okay? So I won't go through much into these, but I have a slide to say a little bit more on each of these. The first of these traditional ethics approaches is the humanistic approach. It does something, right? Teach great and not so great books, right? Students, maybe especially computing science students, don't really want to read Immanuel Kant. They should, whatever. But you can take variations on that. Hell, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy I've used sometimes because it gives better synopses of complex views. In the work with Google, we've actually found that giving people 3 sentences about a theory of duty is enough for them to get to be reasoning about a tech problem in fairly sophisticated ways. And we did a pilot of that in Coast 125 this past summer. Ethics lectures, but I didn't talk about utilitarianism. Well, I probably couldn't hold myself back. But I didn't talk about Peter Singer. Oh, now I'm being recorded again. I said that, but I didn't do the traditional humanistic stuff. We just did real quick interventions. Lectures can do something there. Analytical writing assignments can get them using the concepts in sophisticated ways, okay? But then the role plays, this is the system that I devised here. It's a version of Google's moral imagination, but appropriate for students. I called it Agile Ethics because I wanted the students also to learn something about Agile development processes, right? Used by, I think now 96% of Silicon Valley companies, they use some version of an Agile development process, right? And so I created a bunch of these role plays. What is the Agile method? Well, it's attempting to mimic what's going on in an Agile development process in one of these companies. The students are placed in the midst of a role play in a fast-paced, low information environment. They have to work their way through 4 sprints, right? Where the choices that they're making at first seem entirely technical, and then sort of technical, but a problem is sort of emerging. And then the chickens come home to roost in sprints 3 and 4, and they find that they've got technical debt. It's not easy to solve the problems that they caused. They hadn't anticipated at sprint 1 that this problem might occur, and so on and so forth. And some of the ways that I know casually that these are working is when somebody in sprint 3 or 4 says to the other members of the fictitious team, says, if you had only listened to me in sprint 1, we wouldn't be here today, right? Exactly, right? Okay. So they're competitive in order to also simulate something about the corporate environment, like real workplace pressures. So the team, the development team, there's 8 of them sitting at the front of the room and a bunch of other people observing what's going on. And the people at the front of the room are told they have stock incentives of a certain sort, right? So there's like actually some education going on there as well. They like don't know anything about the vesting cycle of a stock. And so they're actually learning what stocks are and how they put pressures on people, when they put pressures on people, you know, how urgent the pressure is, and etc. But they're told that they're up for a performance review and why they're up for a performance review. And only they know these things. And a lot of this is based on research in organizational psychology, or hell, intuition would tell you how some of these things actually move people's motivations. They're given defined roles on an agile team. So frankly, they're actually just learning what a product manager is. They're learning what a business analyst is and stuff like that. They might learn through one of these actually what the relationship between a CEO and a board is. A lot of them kind of don't know, et cetera, right? But they're also learning how those particular roles might condition a person's ethical thinking and so forth. And then the audience is actually split up into defined stakeholder groups. So some of them are told to act as the board, some of them are told to act as tech writers for a magazine like Wired, right? Sorry, Surya, maybe I should say. Another particular magazine. And they're told to think as end users, and then they can reflect later on whether they really actually came to think that a particular choice was the good one just because they thought it would be the best from the perspective of the board, right? That's something they can reflect on. And it's always a real story where I changed the names on everything, right? So we work with the engineers who were involved in these. Basi, for instance, has helped us with a role play on Meta and its ads algorithm. We're going to have 2 role plays on that in this week. So we're working with people who know the technical steps. We're trying to make it real fast, real short description of those technical steps. How do these people find themselves in problems? And then I can reveal to them at the end, yep, it turns out that you developed the exact same technology that caused this horror story. And from the beginning, I want to say, I don't want to go too far off my script here, but from the beginning, the first computer science class I did this in was Arvind's, right? And he damn near hit the Gong Show gong on me, damn near put down the Muppet Show curtain on me right then. He's like, so you're going to teach them how to make bad choices. Yep. You see our slogan there is well, I don't even know if this code is actually, a freshman wrote this, but this symbolizes our course, do this while unethical. Right? Actually see how the process went awry, right? And see how hard it is to change. And you are, in fact, learning the point of the role plays. And I think, thank goodness, he let me continue. Varun, you were in that room. And I did that, the first one of now many for computer science classes. Okay, and then the class should have something about organizational psychology. As I said, what did I mean by that? Well, we actually use part of this book, Blind Spots, by Bazerman and Ten Brunsell, and we look at cases of where these students want to go to work. Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, right? We look at the McKinsey example of McKinsey consultants knew OxyContin was killing people, and they were helping Purdue Pharma sell more of it. Goldman Sachs knew that they were bribing people in Malaysia, government officials in Malaysia, knew it was wrong. They kept on doing it, right? So look at the parts of those processes that went wrong that led, like, look, I say to them, these are tigers, but a few years out of school, that's our mascot, by the way, for those of you visiting this year. These are Princetonians, but a couple years out of school, all right? How did they go from who you are now to folks who lent a blind eye to some of these things? Also, based on some research from Ron Howard, no, not that one, but an ethics professor at Stanford, I actually have them write an assignment where they express an intent to do something about a technical problem. Now, are they fudging me? Right, and saying, yes, I would do something about that. Yeah, but it doesn't matter, actually, because the research tends to suggest that expressing the intent builds the habit, right? So express an intent. Ethically judge a situation, express an intent, talk about some of the organizational barriers to that, write something about how you would overcome them, right? Research tends to suggest that in and of itself is building something, and then I tell them famous cases of whistleblowers as well, right? And I come not to praise kings and not to bury them either, right? But the real point of the story, when I tell them about Frances Haugen, who you see there, or Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, the Theranos whistleblowers, the real point of the story is, why did so few people, of all the folks who knew, why did so few people have the ethical courage? And so what we actually look at is, for instance, a video of Tyler and Erica saying, I was just so scared, right? Well, I won't go into the story, but for a lot of you know, Erica kind of had more on the line. Right, but Tyler had stuff on the line too. His whole family came after him legally because of what he did, and so there was a lot facing them. Tell the students about what will face them in these pressures. Okay, now, what did we find? It's a bit of a mixed bag. And I want to tell you, we studied students who came out of my class as a cohort, and some of them are in this room today. And we studied them as a cohort, and we compared them to a series of students who had not gone through this class. So there is no causal story to be told here. It's just a comparison of the two. This is a preliminary study. We had 130 students in that class. Less than 100 of them signed up for this study. We did, I do want to say, have a separate test going on where 30-some of them, 39 of them, were tested before the class and after on the same instrument. It was 39. It dropped to like 32 in the respondents. Damn. All right. So give you numbers on that, but you can guess right now. Just the power analysis on it, we just couldn't. Nothing was going to pass a power analysis on that test. Had I had Schwitzgebel's University to work with and 1,300 students, had I had 350, even as the Octower and Lombroso study had, maybe different story, but we'll see. Which is in part to say, if you've got $30,000 lying around, I do need to do this study again. It's Google I should be talking to. Right. So what do we find? Comparing the two groups, yep, students who have gone through my tech ethics class showed an increase in reasoning and an increase in their self-reported propensity to use reasoning when faced with scenarios. I'll get into the details later. A decrease in their self-reported reliance on intuition. I just said decrease as if it's causal. Lower self-reported intuition than the comparison set. So higher reasoning, lower intuition than the comparison set. This time we didn't study view change though, so we weren't totally reproducing that study. I'll get more into that in my final 5 minutes. We saw that these students also showed higher levels of moral awareness, right? And so these arrows are in green because these results are statistically significant. I'll get into later the way in which even some of our non-statistically significant results suggest to me that we need to keep going with this method of teaching and testing, right? But when it came to recognition of unlabeled cases, that those are morally fraught, we did not see a statistically significant result there, although as I showed you, we did see higher recognition. But when it came to information seeking expert opinions and diverse perspectives, we saw higher and statistically significant results there. So the students in this class were doing more of that than the comparison group. Did the class cause it? I mean, you know, my arrogant philosophy student side wants to say, yeah, it was me, but no. All right, that we don't know. We need to test that in another way. Okay. And then when it comes to handling system complexity, there was not actually a composite measure on that. That's why that arrow is still blue. But again, just to remind you what the hypothesis was, it's that handling system complexity would actually lead to better cognitive outcomes. And there, again, a bit of a mixed bag. Confidence, yes, we saw that it was lower among these students, not statistically significant. Perceived difficulty, we saw that, sorry. On this line, actually, the only one that I have data that I can actually show you is the perceived difficulty. We saw that it was higher among these students and it was statistically significant. I'll tell you later that with these other arrows, you're just gonna have to trust me. I don't have the data to show you, so I'm not gonna make a claim about them, right? So there's that. Prioritizing ethical values. Yes, we saw that students who had gone through this class prioritize society's goals more, and they prioritize profits less than a comparison group. That was not all our hypotheses there, but that was where we saw both results and statistical significance. And in perceiving social norms, I apologize to anyone viewing this who's part of the Silicon Valley process, but the class did decrease their sense that tech developers prioritize society over self, at the very least. Again, those weren't our only hypotheses, right? Yeah.
Was enrollment in that class mandatory?
No.
Yeah, so I sort of wonder about self-selection effects and how representative that population is. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on that, or?
Yes, yeah, I mean, for sure. That's one of the reasons why we can't make any inference here, right? So Arvind's ethics of computing wasn't running at the same time, but there's actually a computer science class that they would have known about. No, it wasn't even the same academic year, but there's a potential problem, right? Okay, let's say there was another class that was more congenial to certain computing students or whatever, and Arden's class fulfills one of the same distribution requirements mine did, so they would have had a reason to be in that class. It's so self-selection,
Right, yeah.
right? So it is a problem. It is a problem. Unless you have $30,000 on the follow-up study to this that. Okay. I do want to take questions, but in case we wanted to get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of how specific those findings were, I want to do at least 2 of these slides. I've got specifics on the findings kind of all of these, but I'll just do 2 of these, 2 of the 7 slides, and then if people have questions, some of the other slides will answer. Right. So I told you one of the things was about reasoning and intuition, right? I just wanted to focus on the intuition one here for a second. Students were significantly less likely to rely on intuition or system 1 processes to reach a decision, students in the class, that is, as compared to a control group. So across conditions, this is described on the side here, and I wrote the language down just so that I'm not flubbing my actual explanation to you, right? Across conditions, they relied more on intuition when they were given explicit scenarios than non-explicit ones. So both in my class and out, they relied more on intuition, right? And that would seem to make sense. In the explicit scenarios, they were told people fear that this ethical problem could occur from this technology. So they might be like, I'm gonna go with my gut on this. Pretty much know how to judge this situation. Pretty cool, I thought, was that students in the class relied less on intuition, more on deliberation. So the specific result, we were able to test statistically significant result there. And because I can't help myself, and I think my co-authors might watch this later, I can't help but make normative judgments about things, and they're going to hate this, but the thumbs up are meant to say, good. I think that's what we want. Right. I think that's what we want the pedagogy to do. And there's evidence that it did it. Right. But yeah.
How are you disentangling reasoning and intuition? Because maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but as I reason better, I feel like I build more intuition.
Right. And it's self-reported propensity to rely on intuition. Like, how much do you think you would rely on a 7-point scale? How much do you think you would rely on intuition, which is given a definition, I think at the beginning of the study, to make this decision?
And the proxy for reasoning here is how much they deliberated.
Self-reported propensity to rely on reasoning in coming to a conclusion on this, right? So yeah, in terms of the validity of the instrument and etc., I mean, Tanya and Karen were using it because it is used in studies of moral psychology and etc. So the instrument does seem to pick up some factor and etc. Although, yeah, it's pretty basic in some ways when you think about it. Like there's no Geiger counter through which maybe Elon Musk could help us. Neuralink. Hey, were you relying on reasoning? There's no fMRI here. It's self-reported propensity. But what are we going to say? Like, there was no significant interactive effect here. No evidence students in the class relied statistically significantly less on intuition in labeled cases and in unlabeled cases taken separately. But I show you the data here, and again, my co-authors would be like, oh, don't point to the data and say it. Don't point to the graph and say it shows you something. But heck, I'm a philosopher. But you see that, right? The averages do seem to show that there was an effect there, a substantive, sizable effect in those non-explicit cases. That's the red arrow here, a substantive, sizable effect on making that decreased reliance on intuition. Okay, not statistically significant again, but yeah.
I was wondering, you talked about the comparison across the means, but there's so much variability within the group. So I'm really glad you showed that. Usually people would just plot the mean.
Yeah.
And I think you've highlighted the variability within the groups. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about where that comes from. Because like you've thought so much and so hard to try to get the difference of means, and it's such a small effect relative to all the other stuff.
Yeah. And that becomes even more complicated with the next one, Matt. Let's see if this answers your question, because moral awareness was actually a composite measure of their answers to 3 different things. And they didn't track each other in a given student. So here's another problem here, right? So they answered 3 different moral awareness questions, and they might have shown, as a given student, might have shown themselves to be more morally aware as compared to a control set or whatever. But then on the 3rd one, it doesn't track.
Yep.
So what are we picking up here? Right.
Or what are the other things that create the variability?
Yeah. And the reason I flipped to the next slide is no way to parse that out on this one, because this was a single instrument. Single question. So I could mix it in guesses, but here there is a better way. We could like sit and stare at it and be like, damn, why did those things not track? What was the pattern in not tracking, and etc. But I'll just stop here after 60 more seconds of saying same thing that may annoy my co-authors here, which is when it came also to moral awareness, which was my pet, really part of this project. I'll tell you, students in the class viewed the scenarios as significantly more morally fraught overall, both types of scenarios, than students not in the class. So good, that's something we wanted, but what I particularly would have wanted that in the unlabeled cases where anticipation was required for them to be like, whoa, right? But it's not clear. That's not clear because we didn't get a statistically significant result there. But here also we have this plot, and I believe totally non-scientifically staring at a graph, there's some reason to believe we could show this later, that there was emotion here, or a difference between students who had gone through a class and students who had not, or emotion if we studied it in the right way, possibly. And with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
Question?
Yeah, Matt in the double.
Like what just kind of puzzles me is that it seems so difficult to move people's beliefs about like anticipation to everything, and that this does sound very intuitive too. Like
yeah, so one of the things, and this is actually part of my long sort of disagreement even with my own field, is I've never thought potentially that it was even appropriate to either attempt to move a student's substantive beliefs about an issue or to move their endorsement of a philosophy. So I've actually never tried that. And this is really about changes in their cognitive processing of moral or potentially morally fraught situations, right? You could say it's inappropriate to try to move that too, but but this is an attempt to change substantive beliefs.
I think it's really nice to see someone trying really hard to study things that are hard to study, like teaching and ethics, and you've taken on a very hard problem.
There's a but.
No, there's an and. There's an and. So you mentioned problems of anticipation, and I thought you separated that from problems of foresight, if I was understanding right at the beginning. And I don't understand the difference between the two. And like, if you want people to anticipate things, like in some ways that is a very hard thing, a separate big challenge. So I guess if you could talk more about anticipation and foresight and how you think about those in relation to your goals.
Yes, so that I think that foresight, and we have people doing, studying foresight analysis. Arvin and a bunch of other people just put out a paper on that. I'm not sure if you were on that, right? We have people doing that. Anticipation, I think of as it is not necessary that a person understand what the final outcome would be to anticipate that the road gets a little bumpy for them. So anticipation could be, how am I thinking that at each step in the way, there's potentially morally fraught situation that is either growing or declining. And so anticipation could also include that I arrive at the Wizard of Oz, or it could just include, as I take each step down the yellow brick road, how am I thinking about the next one? That's how I think of it. But I could be playing with words, but I think that's I think that also tracks better on the moral awareness theory.
Mhm.
You don't need to like think about the horror story or the end result to be morally aware. Like I need to start looking for information because I don't know what's coming.
Mhm.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating thought. I mean, how do you deal with sort of this problem of moral relativism? As you get more awareness, you may well wind up disturbing intuitions and having students sort of not feel like there is a moral right answer. Whereas it sounds, or sort of a moral way to tackle a problem, right? Because they feel it's seen. And that seems to be sort of, if you think about tech ethics development, is that one of the criticisms is that there's some obvious answers, but people avoid them by saying, well, it's complicated.
Right. And I got to tell you, actually, within the last year, I've learned a lot more about that question and where it comes from, even just by working with all of you here and computer scientists, right? So Arvind's saying earlier about you're going to teach them to do what's wrong. I was like, yeah. But at first, when he asked, I was like, yeah, I can kind of give you the justification for that, but I haven't really thought it through. Like, kind of know what I'm doing, but and a number of computer science faculty have asked me exactly that. Sasha asked it to me just like a week ago, et cetera. And I think that's really important. And all I can say right now is that my long experience tells me that, and there is some psychological literature on this as well, that the morally relativistic response to complication is actually a sign of immaturity. That's what it's called in the studies, right? So reasoning immaturity. And my long experience tells me that when you show people these disagreements, because I'm not of any particular ethical camp, I'm only ever showing the disagreements. I'm not trying to convince them to be a deontologist or whatever. When you show people these disagreements, they actually get excited about being involved in them, more passionate about picking a side and etc. So that and I got to figure out a way to talk to computer science faculty about this because they're going to be concerned, right? When I say there are at least two ways of viewing privacy and they're not consistent with each other, I do the ethics thing. Am I going to teach their students to disinvest? I think not. There's some reasons to think not, but we can talk about it. Maybe you can give me a better. Calling moral relativism immature is like not going to win any fans either, right? Although there is literature about that. Yeah. One thing I want to acknowledge actually is just in case you are thinking about further ways to study this, I actually have a student team this year, and Sujay Swain right here is part of that student team. They are developing, it's not me, they are developing case studies and they are developing an app. So actually in the future, once we get that perfected, one of the hopes is that other schools can start using this and calling it Princeton's Agile Ethics Method developed at the Center for Information Technology Policy. Let's be real about that. We hope that can happen. The other is, as we have students playing this, we can then actually gather more data. It's quicker and easier to gather data on specifically on the effects of the role plays. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw a small parallel between moral intent and environment.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how moral intent is affected by the environment. And is there any goal in your study about like changing some kind of environment to cultivate like this kind of like deliberation based, more thoughtful and considerate like priorities that come first than other profit like driven groups?
Right. You were saying, is there any part of the way I'm teaching it, or is there
part of like it seems that you're mainly like focusing on individual, like cultivating individual skills of moral reasoning, but
Yeah.
if moral intent ultimately is affected by the environment, then like individuals'
Right.
capacity will be conditioned by those environment, and
Right.
so can this kind of ethic teaching course can also contribute to changing the structural environment, or it's not outside?
Yeah.
There.
So Emily Foster Hansen, one of my authors now at Swarthmore, the paper I mentioned earlier is with a member of their computer science department. They want to look more at things. There's literature about team ethical culture, which matters as well. So were I to have some magical effect and teach students how to be morally aware, anticipate, and all the things, and etc., they could still get into an environment where a couple of bad seeds or whatever could change the team ethical culture. So those are separate studies, but I would certainly say as important as this. I'm just thinking about how can I do it in a college classroom that gives some of the seeds to computer science students that when they step into the development environment in the tech companies, they're armed with something, able to implement a framework in a way that they know they understand why it talks about anticipation, inclusion, and et cetera, et cetera. Just one step in the process.